A cold rain drizzled under the gray afternoon sky as a crowd gathered on the busy sidewalk. Two young men in casual clothes had an elderly man cornered against a brick wall. One youth shoved the old man's shoulder, and the other glared with suspicion. "Stop lying, old man!" one shouted, gripping the old man's coat. The onlookers watched with a mix of curiosity and scorn, convinced they were witnessing a petty criminal caught in the act. The old man's eyes widened with hurt and confusion. His thin hands trembled as he tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He took a shuddering breath, determined to make them listen. "Please, you have the wrong idea," he pleaded softly, voice barely audible in the patter of rain. But his protest only drew mocking laughter from the youths. One of the younger men sneered and raised his voice for all to hear. "He says he's one of us. Can you believe that?" The crowd chuckled. To them, the old man looked nothing like a respectable figure. Rainwater trickled down his wrinkled face as he straightened up to his full, modest height. In a sudden burst of resolve, the old man mustered a firm voice from deep within. I am your commander." His voice, though unsteady, cut through the murmurs around them. For a split second, everyone froze. The mocking smirks faded into confusion and shock. The old man held his breath, bracing for the reaction as his revelation hung in the air, ready to shatter every prejudice in that alleyway. Earlier that same day, the old man had awoken before sunrise in his tiny apartment on the quiet side of town. His name was Henry Thompson, a 78-year-old retired Army general who had long since traded uniforms and accolades for a simple, unassuming life. Henry lived alone. His wife had passed years ago. In the dim morning light, Henry sat at his kitchen table sipping tea from a chipped mug. With a heavy, he thumbed through a weathered photo album. Black and white photographs of young soldiers in muddy trenches stared back at him. There he was in those photos, strong, resolute, dressed in an officer's uniform adorned with medals. Those days felt like another lifetime. Now his reflection in the window revealed a fragile old man in a fraying sweater. To his neighbors, Henry was just a polite old man next door. None of them suspected this humble soul had once led soldiers through war. Henry preferred it that way. He wore his history like an old undershirt, close to his heart but hidden beneath ordinary clothes. He kept his war medals in a small wooden box, only opening it in solitude to trace a finger over those honors, before gently closing the lid again. That afternoon, Henry donned his threadbare coat and stepped out into the drizzling rain to run some errands in town. A folded umbrella in hand, he walked with a slight limp from an old shrapnel wound. The city had grown busier over the years, but he navigated the bustle with quiet patience. As he made his way past the gates of a local army base, he couldn't help but straighten his posture, a habit ingrained by decades of service. He noticed a group of off-duty young soldiers laughing boisterously outside a cafe, their youth and energy reminding him of the men he once led. Henry offered them a courteous nod out of respect, but they barely noticed him. To them, he was just another passerby, certainly not someone who had once worn the same uniform they did. Inside a small grocery store, Henry carefully picked out a few items: bread, some soup vegetables, and tea. While he waited in line at the register, he overheard commotion near the entrance. A store clerk was scolding a teenager who had attempted to slip a bottle of soda under his jacket. The teen bolted out of the store past Henry, and in a panic, he thrust the stolen soda bottle into Henry's hands before disappearing into the rain. Henry stood there, confused, a bottle of soda now in his grasp. The clerk, assuming Henry was the thief, stormed over. "Sir, give that back right now," the clerk yelled angrily. Henry opened his mouth to explain. I didn't," but the clerk snatched the bottle from him before he could finish. Others in line stared with suspicion at Henry, their earlier indifference turning to judgment. Henry felt a flush of humiliation warming his cheeks. He noticed the manager eyeing him warily, as if evaluating whether this elderly man in worn clothes was a shoplifter. No one listened as Henry stammered that it was a misunderstanding. Instead, the manager instructed a security guard to escort Henry outside. The guard, a burly man half Henry's age, grabbed Henry's arm. The guard muttered a dismissive remark and dragged Henry toward the door. Henry winced as pain shot through his bad leg from the rough handling. The rain had picked up outside, the sky now a darker shade of gray. The guard shoved Henry onto the wet sidewalk, where a small crowd of bystanders had paused to watch the drama. Henry caught himself against the wall, his heart pounding not just from the physical jolt, but from the sting of being misjudged so readily. If this moment resonates with you, dear listener, please subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you join us in uncovering more powerful true stories like this one, stories that deserve to be heard. Your support means a lot. Dazed, Henry straightened his coat with trembling hands. He looked at the faces staring at him. Some showed contempt, others amusement. Among them, across the street, stood the same group of off-duty soldiers he'd seen earlier, now observing the scene with smirks. Henry's chest tightened. He had faced enemy fire without flinching, but the disdain in these young men's eyes cut deep. One of them, a tall man with a buzz cut, whispered something to his buddies, and they all laughed, their derision visible even through the rain. Henry felt a familiar heaviness in his heart. It was the same feeling he'd had at his wife's funeral, the feeling of helplessness in the face of life's cruel turns. Still, he mustered what dignity he could. "This is a misunderstanding," he tried to assert to the onlookers, wiping rain from his brow. His voice, though polite, was strained. The burly security guard remained by the doorway, arms crossed, keeping an eye to ensure Henry didn't try to re-enter. Henry realized he had effectively been cast out as a troublemaker. The injustice of it made his temples throb, but he took a slow breath, reminding himself to stay calm. Years of military leadership had taught him to maintain composure under duress. Just as he prepared to leave, a shout came from behind. "Hey, old man!" Henry turned to see the tall, buzz-cut young man, one of the off-duty soldiers, striding toward him with two friends in tow. They had cocky grins on their faces. It seemed they had decided to amuse themselves further at his expense. Henry felt his pulse quicken. He gripped the handle of his umbrella, not for the rain, but as a makeshift cane and perhaps a measure of comfort. The tall youth looked Henry up and down, rain dripping off the brim of his cap. "Stealing soda, huh? Times must be tough," he jeered, eyes cold. Before Henry could respond, the youth waved a hand dismissively to cut him off. "Save it. We saw you thrown out for theft. Don't try to deny it." His tone was mocking and loud enough for the remaining bystanders to hear. A couple of them shook their heads disapprovingly at Henry, fully believing he had attempted to steal. Henry's jaw tightened. "Son, you've got it wrong," he said firmly, meeting the young man's eyes. "I didn't steal anything." He kept his voice as steady as he could, though it quavered at the edges with frustration and hurt. The young soldier stepped closer, rain dripping from the edge of his cap onto his glare. "Sure, you didn't," he sneered. "Guys like you think you're above the law, or just because you're old you get a free pass?" Henry's heart pounded against his ribs. He hadn't felt this kind of adrenaline in years, not since the battlefield. Yet this was a different kind of battle, one for his honor, his dignity. He raised a hand, palm out in a calming gesture. "Listen," he implored. "I don't want any trouble." He steadied his voice and spoke with a calm, authoritative tone that hadn't left him. "Show some respect. You have no idea who I am." His words were measured but carried a weight that made the tall youth falter for just a second. Then, with a scoff, the youth jabbed a finger at Henry's chest. "All right, old man, I'll bite. Who are you, huh? Some kind of big shot?" he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. The other two snickered, one of them mimicking a salute in mockery. Henry felt a surge of resolve well up inside him. He was done being pushed. In that moment, the fire of command flared in his eyes as he prepared to reveal the truth. "My name is Henry Thompson," Henry proclaimed, standing as straight as his old spine allowed. His voice rose with unexpected strength over the rain. "Authoritative. I am a retired Major General of the United States Army." Service number 30571. I led the 22nd Infantry in the Coron Valley Offensive and the liberation of Archer Ridge. Each title and battle name fell from his lips like thunder, authoritative and clear. A stunned hush fell over the scene. The tall youth's smirk dissolved as his mouth hung open. He stared at Henry, trying to process the words. Around them, murmurs rippled through the crowd. A few older onlookers exchanged looks of recognition at the mention of those historic battles. The stocky friend's eyes went wide. "Wait, did he say Major General?" he whispered, suddenly unsure. "What would you do if you witnessed this moment? Would you have stepped in or stayed silent? Let us know in the comments what you think about the young men's behavior and Henry's brave stand. Your perspective matters." A ripple of disbelief and awe passed through the bystanders, but the tall youth shook his head, refusing to back down. No, that's impossible," he sputtered, though his voice had lost its edge. Rain streamed down his face as he tried to muster his skepticism. "You're lying. If you were some general, why would you be here, dressed like that?" He gestured at Henry's worn, soaked clothing, unable to reconcile the old man's humble appearance with the claim of high rank. Henry felt a pang at the question. He glanced down at his fraying coat and scuffed shoes. Why would a celebrated general be standing on a street corner in the rain, alone and unrecognized? His shoulders, which had been squared in defiance, slumped slightly. When he spoke again, his tone was softer. "Because war teaches you what truly matters," he answered. "I don't need to wear a uniform to remember who I am or to serve in my own way. I live a quiet life now. By choice." His words, tinged with melancholy, hung in the air. For a moment, no one spoke. A new voice suddenly cut through the patter of rain. "Major General Thompson, did someone say?" All heads turned toward the curb. A man in his late 40s, wearing a military overcoat, had stepped out of a staff car that had pulled up. On his shoulder flashed the insignia of a lieutenant general. He surveyed the scene, rain dripping off his cap, until his eyes landed on Henry. In the next instant, the officer drew himself up and snapped a crisp salute. "Emotional, sir," he barked, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Major General Thompson, sir. It's an honor to see you again." A gasp rippled through the crowd. The tall youth and his friends looked utterly confounded. Henry peered at the officer's face through the rain, blinking water from his eyes. Recognition dawned slowly. "No, Lieutenant General Peterson," Henry ventured, his voice trembling in surprise. It was him, Stephen Peterson, once a young captain under Henry's command, now a high-ranking general. Henry's mind flashed back to decades ago, a younger Peterson, injured in battle, looking up at Henry with gratitude on that fateful day Henry's unit had rescued Peterson's platoon. Now here they were, face to face, in an unlikely reunion. Henry's throat tightened with emotion. He raised a shaky hand to return the salute, standing as tall as he could. General Peterson stepped forward and gripped Henry's hand firmly with both of his. Rain beaded on Peterson's stern, weathered face, but his eyes shone with respect. He turned to the assembly of onlookers and spoke in a clear, authoritative voice. "This man is a hero. He saved my unit and many others years ago. I owe him my life." Peterson's voice cracked slightly, emotional, as he uttered those words. The crowd erupted in a murmur of astonishment. The story was confirmed by someone who would know, an active general. Private Kowalski, the tall youth who had harassed Henry, looked like he wished he could sink into the ground and disappear. His cheeks burned with shame, and the rain did nothing to hide the tears now welling in his eyes. The arrogance had drained out of him entirely. One of his friends swallowed hard and unconsciously stood at attention, his face pale. The bystanders who had been judging Henry now gazed at him with newfound reverence. A few began to clap hesitantly, and then a swell of applause spread through the crowd. The sound of hands coming together in the rain was oddly melodic, a gentle recognition of a harsh lesson learned. Henry stood in stunned silence, his heart swelling with a mix of relief and overwhelming emotion. He had never sought recognition, and here it was finding him in the unlikeliest of moments. He lifted a hand and motioned softly for the clapping to stop. Sighs. "Please, there's no need for that," he murmured, his voice humble. Under the streaks of rain on his face, it was impossible to tell if Henry was crying, but his voice carried the tremble of gratitude. General Peterson turned sharply toward the young soldiers. "Soldier," he barked at the tall one, "name and rank." The young man straightened up instinctively, heels together. "Private First Class David Kowalski, sir," he stammered. Peterson's gaze was ice. "Private Kowalski," he said, "is this how you conduct yourself with elders? With decorated veterans?" Each word hit like a hammer. Kowalski flinched and dropped his eyes. "No, sir," he managed, rainwater and tears mingling on his face. "I'm sorry, sir." His buddies echoed in, voicing their own apologies in barely more than whispers. For a long moment, Henry regarded the three young men in silence. These could have been his grandsons. They were brash and thoughtless, yes, but he could see they were now genuinely contrite and frightened by the depth of their mistake. Henry's face softened, emotional. "I accept your apologies," he said gently, his gaze moving from one ashamed face to the next. "We all make mistakes. Just remember this: respect costs you nothing, but can mean everything to someone." His words were spoken with quiet dignity, and they hung under the streetlights as the rain began to taper off. The young soldiers nodded earnestly, taking his lesson to heart. If this moment has moved you, please subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you become a part of our mission to share powerful stories like Henry's, ensuring that these lessons of kindness and respect reach more hearts. Thank you for being a part of this community. That evening, once everything had calmed down, General Peterson insisted on driving Henry home. The rain had finally stopped, and the city streets gleamed under streetlights. As they pulled up to Henry's modest house, Peterson helped the older man to his door. Before saying goodbye, Peterson pressed a card into Henry's hand. "Sir, this has my personal number. If you ever need anything at all, please call. We owe you much more than a rainy afternoon's apology." Henry smiled appreciatively and shook Peterson's hand firmly. "Take care of yourself, son," he replied kindly, "and take care of those young troops. They'll remember this day." Peterson nodded. "I will, sir. You have my word." With one last salute, Peterson returned to his car and drove off, leaving Henry standing at his doorway under the soft golden porch light. Henry watched the car's tail lights disappear into the night, and for a moment, he simply stood there, breathing in the cool, rain-washed air. He felt an unexpected lightness within. The heavy loneliness he'd carried for years, the feeling of being invisible, of his past being forgotten, had lifted. In its place was a sense of peace and connection. People finally knew who he was. More importantly, they understood why he was. Stepping inside, Henry hung up his damp coat and turned on a lamp, casting a gentle glow in the small living room. He moved toward the shelf where his wooden metal box sat. With careful hands, he opened it, looking at the rows of medals reflecting the lamplight. For so long, he had kept this part of himself hidden. But now he realized he didn't have to anymore. The world around him had changed, yet the values of honor and respect he held remained, and they were worth sharing. He picked up one medal, his silver star, and closed his eyes, remembering the brave souls connected to it. "We did it. Old friends," he whispered, voice trembling with emotion. "Our story won't be forgotten." It was as if he were speaking to the ghosts of his fallen comrades, letting them know that their legacy lived on. A gentle breeze outside rustled the curtains, and Henry felt as though those friends were right there with him, standing at ease. The next morning, golden sunlight broke through the clouds. When Henry opened his front door, he was greeted by a surprise. A copy of the local newspaper lay on his stoop, likely left by a thoughtful neighbor who knew his story. The headline read, "War Hero's Identity revealed in rainy confrontation, a lesson in respect. Henry blinked in astonishment at seeing himself described in print. There was even a photograph, a rain-soaked image of General Peterson saluting Henry on that sidewalk, the younger officer's face full of pride, and the older man standing at attention. The image was powerful. 2 generations of soldiers united in respect under the rain. As the day went on, Henry found that word had spread through town. Neighbors he'd never spoken with before came by to congratulate him or simply to thank him for his service. A couple of local veterans visited to shake Henry's hand and swap a few stories, having recognized his name from the news. Henry graciously welcomed them, heart warmed by the camaraderie that filled his once quiet home. Over the next days, the young soldiers from that rainy day returned to Henry's home, eager to make amends. They helped mow his lawn and carried groceries as gestures of respect. More importantly, they spent time with him, listening to his stories and learning from his wisdom. Henry was deeply touched. Their presence turned his once lonely routine into a time of camaraderie and laughter. He cherished their newfound friendship as much as they respected his experience. In those genuine interactions, Henry saw hope for the future. These young men had stumbled, but they had also learned and grown. And Henry himself had grown too, realizing that sharing his story could be as meaningful as living it. Perhaps there was a reason his path crossed with those youths that day. Perhaps life was waiting for him to step forward again, not as a commanding officer, but as a guiding light for others. One peaceful evening, Henry sat in his armchair by the window, a soft, nostalgic tune playing on the radio. He closed his eyes as a nostalgic tune played softly on the radio. In that moment, he felt his late wife's proud smile and the presence of his fallen comrades around him. A tear rolled down Henry's cheek, this time a tear of gratitude and peace. He opened his eyes and noticed the little American flag he kept on the bookshelf, a small memento of his service. He stood up, walked over, and straightened it, the simple act carrying profound meaning. In the quiet of his home, Henry Thompson, the man once thought to be a nobody, stood tall. He knew now that no matter what others see on the outside, a person's true character runs deep, forged in the trials they've overcome. Have you ever judged someone too quickly only to be proven wrong? If this story moved you, please share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your own experiences or feelings after hearing Henry's journey. Remember, every person has a story, and your story matters too. In the days that followed, Henry continued living his humble life, but his heart was lighter and his community larger. And whenever he walked down the street, people recognized the quiet old man not as a suspect or a stranger, but as a hero, their hero, who taught them one of the greatest lessons of all: to treat everyone with dignity and kindness, for you never know who they truly are or what battles they have fought.